pronto puse en el chat un enlace a una encuesta de solo 2 preguntas. Si la pueden llenar ahora, por favor. Es bilingüe la encuesta antes de que empecemos.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Matt Wettstein. I'm the president of Cabrillo College. Welcome.
Buenas noches a todos. Yo soy Matt Wettstein. Soy el presidente de Cabrillo College. Bienvenidos a todos.
We'll begin our program in just a minute, but in the meantime, if you'd like to complete a quick survey, I will place that linked in the chat window.
Vamos a empezar nuestro programa en unos momentos, pero mientras, si gusta, tenemos una encuesta en el cuadro del chat. Si por favor puede llenar la encuesta de 2 preguntas, es bilingüe, antes de que comencemos.
Good evening again, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Matt Wettstein. I'm the president of Cabrillo College.
Buenas noches otra vez a todos. Yo soy Matt Wettstein, soy el presidente de Cabrillo College.
Just before we begin, I'll give one more opportunity for individuals to complete a brief survey before we start.
Justo antes de empezar, voy a dar una oportunidad más para que todos completen la encuesta que está en el cuadro de chat. Es bilingüe, antes de que comencemos.
Before we begin, I also want to cover a few instructions about how to participate in today's session.
También antes de empezar, quiero cubrir algunas pocas instrucciones tocante a cómo participar en la sesión de hoy.
Please keep your microphone muted until we invite questions and discussion. On the Zoom app, you can tap the microphone icon to mute or unmute in the bottom left, or on a phone, press *6.
Pedimos que por favor mantengan sus micrófonos en silencio. En la computadora está en la esquina izquierda inferior. Puede hacer clic en el icono del micrófono y en el teléfono oprima *6.
We invite you to turn your camera on. We'd love to see people's faces, but we also understand if you need to keep it off.
Invitamos a todos, si gustan, prender sus cámaras, pero nos encantaría ver los rostros de todos, pero también entendemos si lo necesita mantener apagado.
A reminder, we are recording the main session. You can decide whether you want to be seen and heard in the video.
Un recordatorio que estamos grabando la sesión principal, así que usted puede decidir si quiere aparecer tanto su rostro y su voz en el video.
We are providing simultaneous interpretation into Spanish so that everyone can participate in their preferred language.
Estamos proporcionando interpretación simultánea al español, de modo que cada quien pueda participar en su idioma preferido.
For Spanish, you can click on the globe icon and select ES for Spanish. To hear only the interpreter's voice, also click on the blue bar that says Mute Original Audio.
Si gusta escuchar en español, por favor haga clic en el icono del globo y haga clic donde dice ES para español y además oprimir la barra azul donde dice Mute Original Audio o silenciar audio original.
In addition to our interpreter, Stella, thank you, we also have Beatrice providing bilingual meeting support for us today.
Y además,
Excuse me, Beatriz will be translating English chats into Spanish and Spanish chats into English.
Además de nuestra intérprete Estela, también tenemos apoyo de parte de Beatriz y ella va a traducir los chats los del inglés al español y del español al inglés.
And so we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the chat in English or Spanish throughout the session.
Le animamos a compartir sus preguntas o sus observaciones en el chat, ya sea en inglés o en español durante toda la sesión.
We'd also like to ask everyone to rename themselves if they like. This helps us know who's participating on which language channel.
También invitamos a todos si gustan cambiar su nombre o hacer un cambio, y esto nos ayuda a saber quién está participando en cuál idioma.
Excuse me, I'm just sharing. To
Ahora
rename yourself, look for your video tile or your picture and hover your mouse over the top right corner until you see the 3 dots. Click the 3 dots and you should see a menu appear. Select rename or renombrar and add English for English or ESP for Espanol or BIL or for bilingual, meaning you might be on either channel.
Si gusta, puede hacer clic en su foto, en su pequeño video de su rostro, hacer clic en el botoncito azul que trae los 3 puntitos y después puede hacer clic en su nombre y poner al lado de su nombre las letras ENG para inglés, ESP para español o BIL para bilingüe.
We also have closed captioning available. Although it's only in English, you can choose whether to see or hide the subtitles by clicking on the CC icon and selecting Hide Subtitles or Show Subtitles.
Si gusta ver los subtítulos, vamos a prenderlos y si no gusta leer los subtítulos, puede hacer clic en el icono que dice CC y puede esconder o hide donde dice Hide Subtítulos.
You can also share feedback throughout the session using the reactions, such as clapping hands, thumbs up, or other emojis. This is also where you can raise and lower your hand if you'd like to say something, though we'd like you to remain quiet during the lecture.
Y también ahí es donde usted puede usar los iconos de reacción, puede aplaudir, alzar el pulgar o usar los otros botones, pero sí les pedimos que por favor guarden silencio durante la presentación.
If you'd like any help with Zoom during the session, you can send a private chat message to Kristen Febos in English or Beatriz Trujillo in Spanish.
Y si necesita usted ayuda o apoyo con el Zoom, puede mandar un mensaje privado a Kristen Febos en inglés o si no a Beatriz Trujillo en español.
And at this point, Stella will stop the consecutive interpretation and we'll go on to the Spanish channel, and then we will introduce our speaker and the session.
Y ahora Estela va a pasar al canal de español para hacer la interpretación simultánea y vamos a presentar a nuestra presentadora.
Thank you, Stella. So thank you again for being here. Again, I'm Matt Wettstein. I'm the president of Cabrillo College, and I want to thank you for being here for our kickoff lecture in this name exploration series. I'll give one more opportunity in the chat window to allow individuals who came in late to do a quick survey if they would like. And that should be appearing just a moment. Looks like I've got it twice, so give me 1 second here. So if you can, while we're doing the introductions, go to the survey. It's a very quick 2-question survey. At this point, it's my honor to introduce Cristina Cuevas, a member of our Board of Trustees who's been chairing our Name Exploration Committee. Cristina.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you for joining us for this first of a series of community events examining the origins and the impact of naming our college after Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. Before we begin, I want to provide a little background on why we're hosting community names exploration events and what we hope to achieve by engaging with you. In July 2020, Cabrillo's Board of Trustees received a request to rename the college in response to widespread national social unrest and critical analysis of the college's namesake. In recognition of the concerns of the faculty, staff, students, and administrators, we established a process to explore that request. To do so, a board subcommittee was authorized to explore the name of the college and eventually recommend to the full board a proposal as to whether or not the name should be changed. The subcommittee then assembled a task force to create a process for exploring this type of institutional change request. The process includes a series of public events to learn more about the history of the namesake, the decision to name the campus after him, and the impact of his legacy, how his legacy is affecting the community we serve. During this process, we've been guided by a commitment to the mission of the college, to research-based decision-making where diverse perspectives are considered, and to engaging campus stakeholders in the larger community in a respectful dialogue. Ultimately, we hope what we learn together through these events, coupled with community feedback, will help us formulate our recommendation regarding the request to change the name of the college. Please note that the purpose of this series is to inform the creation of a recommendation on the naming. We are not yet considering other naming alternatives at this time. We invite you to join us in learning more and encourage your comments and questions to the series of community name events via our online services, which Matt has just described. And now I'm going to turn it back to Matt Wettstein, our president and superintendent of the college, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And I want to take an opportunity to thank you, Adam Spickler, our other trustee, and also Amidia Frederick for serving on the committee and for helping to plan these events. I'm going to share screen right now to begin to move to the introduction of our speaker and to be able to run the slideshow. And hopefully you can see that. A quick thumbs up if you can. All right, great. And tonight's speaker, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Iris Engstrand. She is a Professor Emeritus of History from the University of San Diego, a native Californian, and she earned her PhD in history from USC, and along with her bachelor's and master's degrees from there as well. And she is a proud graduate of Orange Coast College, one of our sister colleges in the community college system. She is the author of 21 books and numerous separate book chapters and articles on Spain, California, and the West. Her books include the award-winning San Diego, California's Cornerstone, Spanish Scientists in the New World, the 18th Century Expeditions, and William Wolfskill, Frontier Trapper to California Ranchero. Her article entitled Of Fish and Men, Spanish Marine Science During the Late 18th Century, published in the Pacific Historical Review back in 2000, won the Bolton Award given by the Western History Association. She serves as a co-editor of the Journal of San Diego History and has appeared on the History Channel and local TV programs, including San Diego History. She has many academic honors, including USD's, University of San Diego's Distinguished University Professorship, and also the Davies Award for Faculty Achievement. She's received awards of merit from San Diego, Southern California, and California Historical Societies, the Western History Association, and Orange Coast College. Her research and teaching expertise have allowed her to secure fellowships from the Fulbright Commission, from the American Philosophical Society, and the Huntington Library, and the California Design Award in Historic Preservation. She is a trustee of the San Diego Natural History Museum, the San Diego Maritime Museum, past president of the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch, and of the Western History Association. She has lived and traveled extensively in Spain and Mexico, and she lectures widely in both English and Spanish. Probably one of the most interesting things about Iris, she is a recipient of the prestigious Medal of the Order of Isabella the Catholic, the ruler of Spain in 1492. And she received that from Juan Carlos, King of Spain, for her outstanding contributions to the study of the history of Spain in the Americas. So with that, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Iris Engstrand.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about the history of Spain, which I've specialized in. And I'd also like to thank the Cabrillo College community for the invitation to be here today, or maybe should say here this evening. The purpose of my lecture is to describe some of the historical facts that we know about Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. I'll also spend some time confronting the false or misleading statements that have been made in reference to Cabrillo. I'll provide plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of my talk. Let me start with the most important historical context for any discussion of buildings and institutions that are named after historic figures like Cabrillo. Factors of time and circumstance must be considered. All of us who study history know very well how events and people over centuries, or even those separated by just a few years, cannot be held to the same standards of behavior. Bands of families escaping domination by powerful leaders such as Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, or Napoleon, moving across Europe or Asia, and had no choice but to disrupt civilizations in their path. Residents of Spain and Portugal were overrun by Greeks, Romans, Visigoths, and Moors for hundreds of years. Indigenous peoples, now known as Native Americans, or still as Indians, were attacked and killed by hostile indigenous neighbors who occupied adjoining lands for about the same amount of time, some 10,000 years. This was the case of the Aztecs, who left an area in southern Utah sometime in the 14th century to march southward into today's Mexico to annihilate the indigenous Toltecs, fellow natives who occupied a fertile area of central Mexico. The Aztecs conquered many natives, including Tlaxcalans, who later became allies of the Spaniards. The Aztecs often tortured men and sacrificed women in so-called religious ceremonies. They invaded the Mayans on the Yucatan Peninsula, conquering those natives as they met along the way. Even in North America, indigenous peoples such as Apaches and Comanches, not just far-off Aztecs, were conquering and subjugating each other long before the Spaniards arrived. Into this 15th century world was born Juan Rodriguez. He added the name Cabrillo in Guatemala much later to set him apart from others with the same name, as common as John Smith. Juan was born in the southern Spanish town of Palma del Rio about 1497. His land had been occupied by Moorish invaders, establishing and maintaining a new Muslim religion for 700 years. The Moors were finally defeated in 1492 and Christianity returned, but there were no jobs for young men and their future was bleak. A neighboring town manufactured crossbows, but offered little employment. Some young men, however, had heard of possible land opportunities and perhaps riches that could be had in the overseas area recently discovered by Columbus. Juan Rodriguez, at the age of about 13 or 14, took a chance on finding either or both. The Spanish government encouraged conversion of new peoples to Christianity and even into marriage with native women to produce new Spanish Christians. The history of Cabrillo's life in Central America is well documented. He first traveled to Panama and then to Mexico, where he joined the army of Hernan Cortez to conquer the Aztecs and free many Indians from a cruel Aztec rule. They were also committed to introducing the Catholic faith. As a trained crossbowman, Cabrillo reached Mexico in 1520. He joined the soldiers, but also showed nautical talent and boat building skills. He worked on the building of boats to cross Lake Texcoco, which surrounded the Aztec stronghold. After peace was restored, Spaniards received encomiendas, a kind of land grant that included a right to work the land with the service of natives in exchange for their protection, education, and conversion to the Catholic faith. Franciscans built hospitals and convents, and the Virgin of Guadalupe became well known among believers. As land became less and less available, Cabrillo decided to join Pedro de Alvarado in the conquest of Guatemala in the late 1520s. Having built boats to defeat the Aztecs on the islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco, Cabrillo continued in this profession and began building boats for Alvarado and himself. He planned to continue as an explorer when it became known that it would be possible to find a shorter route to China by sailing northward in the Pacific. He received a grant of land, settled down with a native woman, and a recognized arrangement called a barangania, and became the father of 2 daughters. Although he married a Spanish woman later, he always acknowledged his daughters, who married Spaniards, who in turn were included in the probate of his estate. When hearing of the possibility to reach China by sailing to the North Pacific, Cabrillo planned a maritime voyage. Sailing from the port of Navidad on the coast of Jalisco, Mexico, on June 27, 1542, Cabrillo had been commissioned by Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza to sail 3 ships, his own San Salvador, La Victoria, and San Miguel, to explore the Pacific coast of California as far north as the Strait of Anian, a legendary passage to the Atlantic Ocean. His ultimate goal was not to engage with the Indians, but to find a shorter route to China. The expedition reached Cabo San Lucas on July 2nd and Isla de Cedros, or Cedros Island, on August 5th. Proceeding northward along the coast, Cabrillo took formal possession at Ensenada de Todos Santos on September 17th and reached present-day San Diego Bay on Thursday, September 28th, 1542, the eve of the feast of St. Michael Archangel. Naming the Bay San Miguel after his smallest ship and the saint whose day they celebrated, Cabrillo and his men went ashore and presented gifts to the local Indians, first known as Tipai, later as Digueños, and eventually Kumeyaay. The native peoples, by means of signs, informed the Spaniards of the presence of men with similar features, dress, and equipment in the interior. The expeditionaries were no doubt Melchior Diaz and Hernando de Alarcón, who had entered California from the Colorado River Basin in 1540. The Spaniards established a limited but successful trade with the Kumeyaay natives, and after a few days, continued northward on October 3rd. They stopped at the Channel Islands, Carpinteria, and other coastal and island anchorages. Cabrillo died in Chumash territory on January 3rd, 1543, as a result of a fall, injuring his shoulder, probably not from gangrene, but from a bacterial infection, because he died too rapidly for gangrene to have set in, and was buried on an island the Spaniards had named La Posesión a few months before, and then renamed it Isla de Juan Rodriguez in his honor. Cabrillo's final words encouraged the crew to continue the reconnaissance of California's coastal waters before returning to New Spain. They sailed perhaps as far north as Cape Mendocino. They reached the port of Navidad on April 14, 1543, with the sad news of Cabrillo's death and a report of their limited discoveries. Cabrillo's own journal has yet to be found. In all the documents concerning the life of Cabrillo in Guatemala, including the administration of his gold mines, none of the generalizations promoted by people advocating for the college to remove the name of Cabrillo are true. Some of these claims have been advanced in newspaper stories that have been published locally. Taking each claim one by one, they can be shown as patently false. Genocide. One claim made about Cabrillo is that he was somehow engaged in genocide. This is an emotionally loaded and generally misused word. It means the deliberate annihilation of a race. The last thing the Spaniards wanted to lose was their Indian converts, and yes, as workers. The Spaniards were surprised and dismayed at the number of native deaths from illness. Many Spaniards also died of smallpox alongside the Native Americans. Control of death caused by disease was in no way understood by Spaniards or other European colonizing nations. Today, we have COVID-19. My point here is to say that Cabrillo was not involved in what we would call genocide. He was a soldier under the command of the Spanish military for a period in his life. This is an important distinction that should not be trivialized. Moreover, his expedition along the coast of California was certainly not rooted in genocide, far from it. A murderer. Murder is the intentional killing of a defenseless individual. Today, we do not call our soldiers or sailors murderers when following their military orders. If so, there would be quite a few murderers surviving in the US today. There is no known instance of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo personally murdering anyone. He was part of an army composed of Spaniards and native Tlaxcalans who defeated the Aztecs. He worked with a crew building boats to reach the Aztec stronghold on Lake Texcoco. A slaver. There are some who claim Cabrillo was a slave owner. We forget that Queen Isabel of Spain produced laws outlawing slavery in the New World, except for prisoners of war captured on the battlefield. Native Americans who willingly acknowledged the divinity of Jesus Christ and the teaching of the Catholic Church were not to be enslaved. In a pre-industrial era, however, slavery was the only source of mass labor, a given necessity. In fact, the slave trade to the New World was initiated by Portugal, and it is worth noting that the Portuguese got their slaves from Arab and Black slavers ransacking Africa. Slavery is still practiced in probably more than 167 countries and affects over 45 million people of all ages, sex, and ethnicity. A sex trafficker. There are few areas today that do not have sex trafficking at every level, including many cities in California. The list of worldwide agencies attempting to stem the tide is virtually endless. Sex trafficking is endemic to the globalized world. It is not fair to single out Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo for perhaps being a sex trafficker, and the comments about him come from questionable sources. In the 16th century, sex trafficking worldwide was not a crime, but an accepted fact of life. Cabrillo was a man of his times, not ours. The source of the idea of sex trafficking by Cabrillo is found in a letter written to the king on 20 November 1539 by Bishop Marroquin of Santiago de Guatemala. In this letter, he states, the alcaldes have rounded up Indian women and girls to serve the men of the shipyard, not the ships, as bed companions, cooks, and laundresses. Children born of these unions, mestizos, became Spanish citizens. The alcaldes, who were mayors of the local communities, operated under the orders of Pedro de Alvarado, not Cabrillo. Spanish law forbade women to be aboard ships except as passengers, and any captain who broke the law was subject to severe penalties. As I indicated earlier, we know that Cabrillo had a relationship out of wedlock with an indigenous woman and fathered 2 children. These 2 daughters were recognized in his estate after his death. The fact that Cabrillo had an out of wedlock relationship and children does not seal the deal on sex trafficking. Far from it. In my view, any claims that he was engaged in sex trafficking places the blame at the feet of the wrong person. So here's his significance. Regarding Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in California, it should be remembered that his commission from Antonio de Mendoza, the viceroy in Mexico City, contained only these elements. 1, map the coast to the north to chart a course to China. 2, locate the Strait of Anian, if it exists, a route from Europe above Canada to the Pacific. 3, reach China and establish trade relations. Further, Viceroy Mendoza had stipulated that the Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo expedition would not harm any of the local natives they encountered, except in self-defense. Cabrillo himself would want to maintain peaceful relations along the coast, as he needed places to gain fresh water and provisions. 4. Cabrillo is not credited for the discovery of California, since Francisco de Ulloa had already reached the tip of the Gulf of California and followed the Pacific coast to approximately Cedros Island. Vizcaíno did not follow Cabrillo's route to the north until 60 years later, and when he did, he was not sure of where certain names bestowed by Cabrillo actually belonged. 5. These expeditions of the 16th and 17th centuries had no effect on the indigenous peoples, and there is no cultural memory among these people of receiving foreign visitors, nor of a massive onset of disease in the Kumeyaay or Chumash oral traditions. 6. Cabrillo's voyage resulted in his discovery of the winter wind pattern and the south trending California or Pacific current of California. It was the discovery that was the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle, allowing trade with China by pointing the way to get to China and then to get back. The discovery of the Great Pacific Circular Current began with the development of the Pacific Ocean trade patterns, something that impacts the entire Pacific Ocean basin to this day. For this reason, Cabrillo can and should be recognized as a forerunner of useful nautical information and worthy of being remembered in the name of Cabrillo College and other institutions. To put it simply, it is the accomplishments of Cabrillo as a navigator and explorer that establish his reputation in history and make him worthy of recognition. There are a number of good sources that people can turn to for information on Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. I've provided some information on those sources on this last slide. Let me stop there and answer any questions that you folks might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iris. And if I can just take the privilege of asking a first question before we turn to the chat window. I wanted you to focus a little bit on what used to be a controversy of where Cabrillo was born and what country can claim him as their birthright, so to speak. For decades, Portugal has made the claim. And there's some research by Wendy Kramer that suggests that definitively he is from Spain and a Spanish citizen. And I wonder if you could tell the story about how Wendy came across documents related to making that claim. And if I remember correctly, they turn on a theft of some gold on a ship that he was on, and court records or testimony that Cabrillo had to give relating to that theft. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, in the 1530s, he returned to Spain, or he was on a ship to go to Spain in order to become married to a lady from Seville. But on the ship, for some reason, the gold was, they were searching for the king's gold that they were shipping back to Spain, and it was gone. And so they started interviewing all the people who were on board this ship. And Cabrillo said, no, I didn't do it. And they searched his cabin, I suppose, and everybody else. But they said, when you get to Seville, we're going to have a hearing if this gold isn't returned before we dock. So they finally had a court hearing in the archives of the Indies in Seville. And if you had a deposition that says, state your name and place of birth before you testify. So he said, my name is Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, and I'm a native of then Palma de Mesergilio, which is later now Palma del Rio. And there was no doubt about, you're not going to lie in a deposition in court. So he said that he was a native of Spain. And Wendy Kramer was actually doing research on Gabriel Cabrera. She was not a Cabrillo scholar in any way, but she saw this, and because we have friends, Harry Kelsey, others who have done research, she said, oh my gosh, this has got to be important. And so she telephoned Harry and then the newspaper here in San Diego. And it's been a long, tough battle. And we don't want to fault the Portuguese, because they had seen a footnote in a 16th or 17th century history of Spanish exploration, but just one reference. So this time we had a deposition, and then since then, Wendy's found probably 25 documents that show his life in both Guatemala and in Palma del Rio. Oh, by the way, the deposition and the materials that Wendy was looking at were 950 pages. So you have to say that our researchers do a good job in trying to get the truth.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Iris, there's a question in chat, and we're going to alternate between Kristen and myself. But there was a question early on in your reference to settling down with a Native woman and becoming the father of 2 daughters. And the question comes from Rena Dubin asking if you could provide more context around that.
Well, when he was first in Guatemala, he was living with a group of Indians, Native people, and it was pretty common. And it was even encouraged by the Spanish government to, I don't know how you'd put it, settle down with Native women and marry them and create new Christians with loyalty to Spain. And so that's most of, Central and South America consist of mestizos from the earliest days. And he always looked after them. He always, took care of them. And there might have even been another 1 or 2 children too. We're not exactly sure, but Wendy's done quite a bit of research. And we know these 2 for sure because they married Spaniards and were later included in the probate of Cabrillo's estate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. The second question comes from Juliana Cheng, who wants to know the significance or what New Spain means. New Spain equals what? Is her question.
Bueno, Nueva España. It was the New Spain. When they got to the New World, they felt that this was Spanish territory. They claimed it. And in those days, obviously, we didn't have very good documents. The natives of the new area, the New World, didn't have any what we would have as deeds of trust or anything like that, or boundaries. They were pretty much mobile. And so they took all of the area from Alaska to the tip of South America and called it the New Spanish Territory and claimed it for the King of Spain, as it was not occupied or legally in any documents.
There are a couple of questions around the slave issue. And so the ownership of slaves and where the rumors of Cabrillo owning slaves, how did those get created? So that's a question from Phoenix, also from Poco Marshall in our chat. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about the slave ownership and relationship with slaves that Cabrillo might have had in Guatemala.
Well, it's very hard to pin down the word slavery. They actually took the Indians in and had them as workers, but they fed them, well, I guess whatever clothes they wore, but they actually supported them in a sense that we don't really know that much about. They were not cruel to the Indians, and there's a lot of exaggeration of their beatings from what's called the Black Legend, which was promoted by the Dutch, who were anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish, and the British. And so about 100 years later, a lot of drawings and things from the Dutch came out about how cruel the Spaniards were. Well, we don't know exactly how they treated the Indians. No, the Indians didn't have any written language, so they couldn't write back and say, yeah, I was beaten up today. But we have everybody, we've done a lot of research in the actual archives, and you don't see exactly how they were treated. We know that it probably wasn't a fair trade. I mean, the Indians were under the control, so to speak, of the Spaniards, but they were also fed and clothed, such as the clothes that they wore, by the Spaniards. But there was no out and out deliberate cruelty that we know of, except I guess if the Indians were going to run away or beat up somebody, they might have punished them, but that just goes on. But all of our employment of people from, the United States, slavery in Brazil, every place in those days, there wasn't any mass employment that we know of, that you can, go down to the unemployment office and get some workers. So whatever the word means to different people in different times, we can't exactly pin down.
Thank you. The next question in the chat might be one for Matt, asking how and why Cabrillo as the school chose the name.
Well, I think we'll hear about that in an upcoming session scheduled on April 15th. The shorthand story, and I don't want to steal a lot of thunder, is that the selection of Cabrillo was recommended by a newspaper reporter, columnist, who recommended the name of Cabrillo during that time frame back in the 1959 period when the college was just being formed. And there were a couple of names that were considered. You can hear the story around that and the history and the selection at Sandy Leiden's talk that's scheduled on April 15th at 6 p.m. in our series. I want to come back though, and Iris, this may be pushing you a little bit, but there was a question from, I think it was Layla Diaz, about the notion of genocide. So if not engaged in acts of genocide or inciting genocide, where do people get that conception if that's not the case? Because in a sense, I think the argument would be that there was the systematic destruction of a race of peoples that took place.
No, the Spaniards certainly didn't commit what you'd call genocide today. That's the deliberate annihilation of a race. It's like the executing the Jews, en mass. But they were trying to keep their workers healthy. They never killed them. If you wanted to talk about genocide, you could talk about the American Gold Rush when they were committing, the only good Indians, a dead Indian, and they had a bounty on their head. No, the Spaniards wanted them to all be alive and well, and even if they wanted to work for them, but they wanted them to become Christians. They had, Catholic services, and genocide, that word just doesn't apply to the Spanish motives in the New World. They wanted to keep the Indians alive, even if you just said just as workers or even as slaves. They certainly didn't want them to die.
Go ahead, Kristen. I think you've got the next one.
Thank you. So the next question I see in the list is from Chris Crone, who writes, hard for me to believe you are defending an imperialista, owner of slaves, and someone who took order from Hernan Cortez. Why do you think it is okay for Spaniards to come to the New World, conquer people as if it were a good thing? Because as you pointed out, the Aztecs were harsh towards other indigenous people.
Well, it's like the history of the world. The Greeks conquered the Romans conquered the Spaniards, or the Visigoths conquered the Iberians. The history of the world is when people run out of land and they have no money or means of support, they go somewhere else. And so when they came to the New World, they found lots of land, and actually, it was kind of a new start in life. There was no possibility. I mean, Cabrillo's like 14 years old when he's with Cortez's army. And yeah, I'm sure he was just caught up. They dumped all these young kids who were going to the New World off and said, here, these guys will help you conquer the Aztecs. And they joined with the Tlaxcalans right away. And some other Indians who said, yeah, let's get rid of these cruel Aztecs. So it's just the history of the world. If people study it, is everybody, to be held accountable for moving into another area when their area is bleak and there's no way to get ahead. In the Spanish civilization, the firstborn son inherited all the land. The second-born son usually went in the military. Third-born son went into the church. So the fourth one had nothing. He had better go somewhere else and find some land and find some way to make a living and get married. And most of the Spaniards that came did marry the natives, the indigenous peoples.
There's a question from, I think it's Lee in Flex Education that is asking about what, like the trade route to China and what it was about. Why would they be seeking goods from China in that
Well,
group?
because of Marco Polo and the earlier overland treks to China from Europe. And then they found if you could get there easily by sea, they didn't really realize that the Pacific Ocean was 10,000 miles across. They had a kind of a warped idea of the map. They thought when you went further north, it angled toward China or like where Japan is now, and that would be an easy way. Then you'd just be almost there instead of the long trek across Europe to go, walking to China or going around, Vasco da Gama at the same time was trying to go around Africa to find a route to China or India. So the whole world in the 15th, 16th century after Columbus was trying to discover shorter routes to the other lands where they might be able to make a living.
Thank you. So the next question is from Juliana Cheng asking who the Portuguese explorer is who landed in Macau and turned Macau into a Portuguese colony for X number of years.
I don't know which one you're talking about, or she's talking about Magellan, of course, was the Portuguese navigator who did set off, although he was killed. And the Philippines and Juan Sebastian del Cano took over. But as far as my specialty doesn't go into the Macau or the Portuguese settlement, but the Portuguese definitely had quite a few areas of the East Indies that were under their control. And Cabrillo actually, at the time, when he went north to the North Pacific, under Villalobos went over to where the Portuguese Indies were at that time, Macau, and lived there until finally he died there. So there wasn't much Portuguese activity at that the Spaniards participated in. They were still, I wouldn't say they were enemies, because a lot of Portuguese worked for Spaniards. It was they're very close countries, and so there was a little bit of an exchange, but they weren't friends by any means, the two countries.
I'm going to read a quote in the chat feature from Poco. It's asking, again, kind of returning to the slavery theme. I'm fairly certain that if you have someone who does unpaid work for you, it's either slavery or indentured servitude, and a lack of cruelty doesn't automatically indicate lack of slavery, is the point. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's true. What are we going to name the employment situation when people go and they feed and clothe these people? Who knows exactly how they got them to work, but the natives in some of these areas that worked on the ships and worked on, but there's certainly cruelty. I'm not going to say that the Spaniards weren't cruel, especially in the mines. Not so much in a gold mine as they did in the silver mines in Peru. There's lots of information about how young boys were forced to crawl in terrible places to get the silver. I'm not excusing the Spaniards for their methods. I'm just saying Cabrillo himself seemed to be a pretty good guy, and but there's all sorts of cruelties that are instituted by the Spaniards. So people just have to make up their minds. It's a different time. It's a different world. It's the 15th, 16th century.
Thank you, Iris. There's a couple of related questions as to whether you were aware of what happened in the Santa Cruz missions, and then a different question of, did Cabrillo ever set foot in Santa Cruz County?
Well, no, he didn't set foot, I'm positive, in Santa Cruz County, because he dies even south of Monterey. And then they took his, back to San Miguel Island, or possibly buried on Catalina Island. They're still trying to figure out where he was buried. Most of my people who sail a lot say that he was probably not buried on San Miguel on January 3rd because it would have been too cold and windy. They probably went back to the lee of Catalina. And there's still some ongoing archaeological investigation on Catalina of some bones that have been found and a sword. So who knows, maybe that was where. But Cabrillo he issued instructions that no Indians were to be hurt or in fact, when they landed in San Diego, a couple of his men were shot with bows and arrows, but they didn't shoot back. Cabrillo said, we're not engaging in any kind of cruelty to the Indians. So you have to give him credit for that.
Iris, I have a question that came to me directly in the chat and may not be in the public chat, but it's asking you as a historian to think about how do you balance what happened decades ago or centuries ago after a site has been named after someone with the connections to the person that we're talking about. So sort of thinking about the contrast of let's say the successes and accomplishments of the college, but being named after someone who might have been responsible for some legacy behavior that we're not proud of today. So as a historian, how do you balance that kind of distinction between someone who might be worthy of blame, but is named, now we have an institution in the current period that's named after him?
Well, I'm actually, I say, whatever your problems are about naming the college or changing its names, it's not my problem. But I think in like the recent renaming of 44 schools in San Francisco, and it's pretty tough now to find somebody in their whole life that didn't do anything wrong. Maybe we shouldn't put everybody's name on numbers, but the statue thing, I'd be for museums. I don't believe in destroying statues or tossing them in the ocean. I think they ought to have a museum that has a plaque that says this guy was not a very good leader, was cruel, but he actually served for 25 years. Who knows? We have the statue controversy everywhere, back east in the South, and we've thrown Columbus into the ocean in San Diego, who never even was anywhere near here. But I think it's everybody's own decision whether they think this person, because of his nautical skills, because of what he did. Just there's a book that you'll see, it's called who gave, Cabrillo is the person who gave California to the world. I mean, he has an actual history that doesn't, I think, include what people feel is genocide or sex trafficking or those things. So if you want to keep the name, I don't think you have to apologize. He was a navigator and made some good discoveries in California. But it's a controversy that's going on throughout the whole United States. It's the missions, Sarah, you can find things to complain about. And it seems like even Leland Stanford, they kicked, Sarah out of the name, but Stanford was no person that never did anything wrong. So I don't know. It's just I'd like just to get people to look at the facts and see what people actually did. And maybe they should put all the buildings with numbers instead of names. Who knows?
Thank you, Iris. So there's a question in the chat as to whether taking people and forcing them to work for free and then taking their religion and culture from them is or could be considered a part of genocide, in that you're killing a culture or wanting a culture to die.
It's not genocide, but it's, I'm not a believer in people going to change somebody's religion. I think everybody has the right to have their own religion and their own beliefs. Nobody sort of has really proven what the actual answer is. And so I would not have been in favor of changing. I think in the middle part of the United States and the Pueblo Indians and some of them, they were more tolerant of the religion than in California. The Kachina dolls remain. Father Kino was quite a bit more liberal with the Indian ceremonies themselves. No, I don't certainly believe that one culture gets to go change another and force them into a religion that they don't believe. But that's the way the world has been in a lot of places. And we still have, missionaries and Bible translators and all sorts of people that are, wanting to put their religion on the shoulders of someone else. But I don't think people should be doing that.
I've got one question from Emmy that I want to relay to you. So if you were to speak about the negative aspects of Cabrillo, and the aspects of his legacy that are negative. How would you describe them? What would they be?
Well, he used Indians. You could say he exploited Indian workers in order to build his ships, but he did a really good job of building the ships. And in fact, in the book on just the ship, the San Salvador, it's interesting how Cabrillo was able to build a ship that was really a very good, well-built ship that went all the way to North Pacific. And we have the replica in San Diego now, and shows that he had a good sense of engineering and boat building, which seemed to come naturally. He didn't go to boat building school because there wasn't any, but he was able to build a galleon that was absolutely a perfect sailor. So that if you were going to honor him, it's for his nautical skills or for his boat building skills or for his exploration. But if you want to change his name, then I guess you certainly have the right to do it.
Oops.
Okay, thank you. I've seen a hand up for a while and I messaged him privately, but Miguel Cajero, are you on the call and would you like to ask a question?
I don't think he has his.
May not have his audio on.
Yeah.
So we'll keep moving forward then. Oh, his question is in the chat. So he messaged me privately. Did Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo go to, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, yes, I'm Miguel.
thank you.
Tenochtitlan.
And was he
Yeah.
around when the Virgin de Guadalupe appeared to San Juan Diego?
Well, that's very controversial because that happens in 1531, and there's a lot of information. His group, his survivors of the trip after he died, made a pledge that they would go and visit the Virgin of Guadalupe, the shrine, except that they were also from Spain. So there's the Virgin of Guadalupe in Spain, and it was on Cortez's banner. So there's a little controversy over, see, by that time in the 1540s, the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, who allegedly appeared in 1531, was not too well known. In fact, she's not very well known as the Virgin there until probably about 60 years later, somewhat similar to the Virgin of Guadalupe in Extremadura. And so that is definitely a matter of belief. No one can, you can't pin down whether she talked to Juan Diego or she didn't, and that whole story. But that's a matter of Christian belief. And you can't fault people for what they believe if that's what makes them feel that they're being protected by God. And that story is a good story. So that's still something that you can't prove with, nobody else has seen her but Juan Diego.
Iris, before we wrap up, I wanted to tell folks in the Zoom room that we have a post survey that they're welcome to complete. I'm actually going to post that link into the chat feature. You may need to scroll down to find that if you've been looking in the chat recently. And then I'm going to need to scroll back up. So one question I wanted to present to you is thinking about, and this may be beyond, like you've said, it's not your place to name the college, but we are in this space today in the US where we're confronting all of these questions about institutions that are named after individuals. We've seen it at Berkeley, Stanford, Princeton, George Washington. So how would you reckon dealing with this as a historian?
Well, I would just try to figure out what is important about Cabrillo. What does he signify to the average person? I'm sure if you asked all the people on the street of Aptos what they knew about Cabrillo, it would be probably next to nothing unless they read that article in the newspaper. But I think the important thing is getting his life straight. I mean, just the fact that what he did and what he accomplished. And I don't know, it's going to be up to your college to decide in the town whether or not you want to, if you want to just go for his exploring and his nautical knowledge. I think he's a pretty typical, not cruel Spaniard. I mean, he was very concerned about the natives, that nobody would ever hurt them. And whether he treated them cruelly, we don't have documents that say, well, guess what I did today? I beat that Indian. They don't. If you find those things, then you say, yes, they were mean and cruel. Some were and some weren't. It's just like society today. We have people who are cruel and people who would go after them. So it's just up to you whether or not you want to have him as Cabrillo. And I think just, sticking to the positive would be a good thing. And I wouldn't like to see it change, just because I've spent a lot of time with the documents and reading about his life, and feel that he was really a pretty good guy. And he's 13 or 14 when he gets off to the New World to try to make a living.
Well, Iris, I'm going to thank you for being here and for your presentation. I want to tell the folks in the Zoom room again that we have the opportunity for you to complete a survey at the end of our talk tonight. We'll put that link in the chat box one more time. I think I've done it a couple of times already. I also want to invite you to participate in our second event, which is scheduled for April 8th at 6 p.m. Certain to have a different perspective. We have several Native American experts who will be visiting with us to talk about the impact of the colonial conquest on Native tribes in California. We have local tribal representatives who will be here, including, I think, Stan Rushworth, one of our great professors. We have a professor from UCSC, Humboldt State Parks historian, who will be involved in that panel, and also a couple of students from the local tribe who've been invited to take part in that session. So again, April 8th at 6 p.m. will be the second in our series. April 15th will be the third lecture in our series by Sandy Leiden, our former history professor, history dude, on how Cabrillo College got its name. And then we will close it out in late April with 2 presentations by students on April 22nd and April 29th. So thank you. Thank you for the motorcycle going by. Thank you for attending tonight. We hope you can join us again for our next lecture in this name exploration series. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you for having me too. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure you have a good group of people who are watching this.
Thank you, Iris.